Everybody knows that during England's Wars of the Roses, most infantry consisted of archers, aka longbowmen, and billmen. But is that correct? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, as well as most of my life being consumed by HEMA and antique swords, I also dabble in the world of Wars of the Roses reenactment, and lots of people I know, lots of friends of mine are also involved in that reenactment world, specifically focused on the Wars of the Roses. For anyone who doesn't know, the Wars of the Roses are a period that cover approximately 1455 to 1485 and resulted in the Tudor dynasty coming into effect and the Plantagenet dynasty saying bye-bye. And in English history, it's very often regarded as a defining moment as sort of the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance. Now, obviously, that's overly simplified, but that's how most people perceive it. Now, it's also a glorious period of bloody and nasty feuding and warfare, and therefore it's a great period to reenact because there's lots of blood and murder and battles and weapons and armour, all this kind of stuff. So people that like medieval knights love the Wars of the Roses. It's also the late 15th century, or mid to late 15th century, so it covers this kind of golden age of plate harness that people are so beloved of, and also it was the last really kind of, I guess, strong period of English archery as well, which had been made famous by the 100 Years' War between England and France, obviously with other people involved as well, like Spain and Scotland and so on. But English archery was perhaps made most famous during the 100 Years' War, but was still very powerful and still very important as a battlefield thing in the Wars of the Roses. So you've got this beautiful combination of this wonderful plate armour and archers. Now, in reenactment, as anyone who's ever dabbled in a reenactment will know, there is a lot of kind of inherited knowledge which sometimes people don't go and fact check. Now, as you know, I'm all about the context, and I'm a amateur historian. I'm a historian by degree and by training. And some would say that, I've been studying history. Well, I have been studying history ever since all those years ago that I left university, however many years ago that was now, 20-something years ago. And so as an archaeologist and a historian, I'm all about the primary source material, whether it's what's being dug out of the ground or what I can find in the documents. Now, one of the perhaps misnomers, misconceptions around the Wars of the Roses is that you had two main types of infantry, apart from knights. Okay, now knights or men-at-arms, for the most part, are the fully armoured people who are coming with a retinue, and their retinue consists of various types of troops. So we're really talking about the majority of the troops here, the majority of the army. So we're not looking here at the landed gentry, the landowning people who come in full plate harness and do jousting for fun and this kind of stuff. We're talking about the common soldiery, what most of you and I probably would have been if we'd been around at the time. And we would have given service to our Lord, whose land we lived on, unless we did a turncoat and went off to someone else's land because we preferred their political cause or we preferred their chances of winning in the upcoming conflict. So most of the common soldiery in England at this time were divided between archers and other infantry who were used primarily for hand-to-hand combat. Now, that's not to say that archers can't be used for hand-to-hand combat, but essentially you've got two main troop types that we can sort of get a hint from the sources: those whose primary job is to shoot arrows and those whose primary job is to stand there in some sort of formation. There's a lot of debate about that, but some sorts of formations with pole arms. Okay, so essentially think of this as bows and pole arms. Now, in the modern reenactment world, and indeed in a lot of books, a lot of history books, because a lot of history books receive wisdom in this way and they don't question it, unfortunately. They have often been described as bows and billmen, okay? Now, for the Wars of the Roses period specifically. Now, first of all, what is a bill? In very brief terms, it's one of these. A bill is essentially a polearm. It's usually between about 6 and 8 feet long in total. Usually 7 to 8 feet usually in length. It's got a stabbing point at the top. It's usually, or not always, but it's got usually a striking point at the back, a bit like a warhammer. And then it has a hook at the front, which can be used obviously for slashing or for hooking. So this is a weapon which is in many ways a parallel to something like the halberd. It's got different strengths and weaknesses, but it does a lot of the same things as a halberd. It can chop, it can stab, it can hook. And it's on a long pole. And this became, certainly by the Tudor period, so we're talking about the 1500s, the later Tudor period, so well after 1485, this became the default English polearm, so much so that if we look in sources from, say, Henry VIII's reign all the way up to Elizabeth, then the standard English infantry are often described as billmen. So if we're looking at sources from the 1530s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, then indeed, very often we see infantry described as billmen and archers described as archers, as two distinct groups. Now, this has often been applied by reenactors and indeed sometimes historians writing fairly lightly researched books, shall we say, as archers and billmen in the Wars of the Roses period. But does this apply? So if we look at, for example, the all of the recorded source material, primary source material that we've got on a source, like if we look at British History Online, for example, we will see, if we just type in the word billman, there are absolutely loads of hits for the 16th century. That is the 1500s, so 1530s more or less, all the way through to the end of the 1500s, so about 1600. There are loads and loads of references for billmen, but none for the 15th century. So does that mean that billmen didn't exist in the Wars of the Roses, which is the 1400s, say 1450 to 1485? Not necessarily. So here's what I found. So searching, first of all, one of the complications when you're word searching in historical documents is their way of spelling something is not always the same as ours. So we have a conventional way of spelling a bill as B-I-L-L, B-I-double-L. In a lot of historical sources, it is not spelt like that. A bill is often spelt B-Y-double-L. So therefore, a billman is sometimes spelt as B-Y-double-L-M-E-N. Now, if we search for bills, either with an I or with a Y, because sometimes they're transcribed, even if the original source is with a Y, they transcribe it into I to modern English in, let's say, the Victorian period or Edwardian period. If we search for either of those, then this is interesting. So, first of all, the term billman does indeed seem to be, so far, based on the research I've done, a product of the 16th century, from about 1530 onwards. So, that doesn't mean, however, that billmen didn't exist before 1530. All it means is they weren't referred to as billmen. The question is, why were they only referred to as billmen after that date? I'll come back to that. Now, if we just search for the word bill, B-I-L-L or B-Y-L-L, then indeed we do find hits for the 15th century. And we find it in a wide range of sources. Now, the source that I actually have used quite a lot, or set of sources that I've used quite a lot in previous videos and personal research and articles I've written and lectures and things like this, are the records of the Port of London. Now, a little tangent for a second. So London, I'm sure you've all heard, is the capital city of the United Kingdom, specifically of England. And during the 15th century, for example, during the Wars of the Roses, it was incredibly important. It was one of the most important ports in Europe and had trade from all over the world coming into it. In fact, if we fast forward to Elizabethan period, when obviously the slave trade had started, there are comments about the number of Africans in London because of the slave trade. But anyway, coming back to the 15th century, we have trade coming beyond Europe, but for the purposes of this video, from all over Europe. There's trade coming in from Poland, from Spain, Portugal, Italy, obviously Flanders and France, the German states that later became Germany, and so on and so forth, Holy Roman Empire. So it comes from all over the place. Now, a lot of trade came from Italy. Italians were really good at selling people stuff, and specifically for our field, arms and armour. So we see absolutely loads of arms and armour being shipped in from both Flanders and Italy, being what seems like the two main centres of production and therefore import into England of arms and armour. And what's really good about these records is they list the items. So you will see a number of sallets, helmets listed. You'll see swords, you'll see, pikes, you'll see longbows, all of these things listed. But one thing we see absolutely loads of are bills. And that is, these are records that date to around 1480, and some of them are earlier than that. So unquestionably, we can see that huge numbers of bills were being imported from continental Europe into London during the Wars of the Roses, during this period, 1455 to 85. So without any shadow of a doubt, it seems like loads of bills are coming into England. Now, the question is, are all of the bills coming from Italy? Now, another little tangent. If you look across Europe, the bill as a weapon, as opposed to a halberd or a glaive or a spetum or a corsac or whatever, the bill specifically as a weapon seems to have been most popular, certainly by the 16th century, seems to have been most popular in England and Italy. And even by the Elizabethan period, if we look at George Silver's treatise, for example, Paradoxes of Defence, he talks about the bill quite a bit, but he also specifically talks about different types of bills. There's the forest bill, the black bill, the Welsh hook, blah, blah, blah. There's loads of different types of bill. So it was very evident, and we know this from other sources as well, that the bill and billmen were a mainstay of Henry VIII's armies and indeed later on Elizabeth's armies. So, billmen, super important in the 16th century in England, but were they important in the 15th century? Well, here's my evidence. First of all, the Port of London. We can see that contrary to halberds, glaives, other things coming into the Port of London, bills are numerous. So there was, either because the people who were exporting from Italy wanted to sell lots of bills, or because the people in London and England wanted to buy lots of bills. We can't necessarily say which of those, or whether it's a combination of both, probably both supply and demand. Lots and lots of bills were coming into England during the Wars of the Roses, firstly. Secondly, we also have muster rolls. Probably the most famous one is the Bridport muster roll. Now, I did do a numerical analysis at one point of things listed in there, but without going into depth on that, and I have spoken about the Bridport muster roll before, it is very evident that there are lots of bills. In the Bridport muster roll, it is clear that, and so what is a Bridport? Bridport's a town in Dorset, very nice place, I recommend going there. I've stayed there, it's lovely. But the muster roll is essentially a record recording the soldiers who came, when they were drafted essentially, they were called in for the draft because they need to do military service, and it is recorded what they came with, what equipment, do they have a helmet, do they have a jack, do they have a brigandine, do they have a mail shirt? There's even things like gauntlets and even a full plate harness recorded. So they come for military service and they bring stuff from their little village or hamlet with them that is provided as part of the condition of military service. And bills, lots of bills recorded in there. They do also record other polearms. There's glaives, there's halberds, there's poleaxes, which confirms with what we find from artistic and other written sources like the Port of London imports, that yes, halberds existed in England, yes, glaives existed in England, we see them in the art, but they are less numerous, less common than bills. So, my argument is this, is that yes, indeed, billmen were prevalent in the Wars of the Roses, but they weren't yet called billmen, okay? The fact is that people with polearms were a popular troop type in the Wars of the Roses, and just incidentally, you might find that if you take 100% of your infantry during a Wars of the Roses battle, depending on the battle, depending on the location and the time, there will be a different proportion of archers to, if we just call them polearm users, okay? And sometimes there's a huge number of archers, sometimes they're more level, more equal with the number of people using polearms. But usually there's more archers. So longbows were the bow was very, very important. And there were other types of missile troops. There were gunners, there was crossbowmen, but they're always way, way less common. Because, of course, using the bow had been law in England for a couple of hundred years by this point. So absolutely there were polearm troops, but during the Wars of the Roses, we should expect, from the records available to us, that typical English polearm users would consist of lots and lots of bills, some halberds, some spears, some longer pikes maybe, and then other types of less numerous, you know, some glaives, some other types of polearms mixed in. But it does seem that the bill was probably the most numerous and most popular English polearm in the Wars of the Roses. Ergo, billmen sort of existed, but they weren't yet called billmen. But by the 1530s, so 50 years after the end of the Wars of the Roses, the bill was still so popular and so prevalent and so like the default English polearm. We find them on the Mary Rose, which sunk in 1545. Unquestionably, they're the most common polearm found on the Mary Rose. The default polearm of Henry VIII's army in the 1540s, ergo, was the bill. And that seems to have its roots in a period around the Wars of the Roses. So it's possible that, based on current research, it's difficult to say, but it's possible that at the beginning of the Wars of the Roses, maybe spears were most prevalent, you know, essentially half pikes. Or maybe the bill was already quite popular by that point, but it seems that by the end of the Wars of the Roses, by 1485, the bill was almost certainly the most common polearm in English armies. And that continued to be the case, so much so that the term billman came about by about 1520-30 and was the default term for polearm users for the whole rest of the 16th century and indeed into the beginning of the 17th century as well. So, did billmen exist in the Wars of the Roses? I would say yes, they just weren't called billmen yet, and they were probably not quite universal. It wasn't the universal polearm, but it was probably the most popular polearm. And certainly by the time we get past the year 1500, it seems the bill was so much the default polearm that this term, this standalone term, billman, came about and became the default term for the whole rest of the 16th century. I hope that's been useful, and obviously there's a lot more digging to be done on these sources. I want to give a special shout out as well to Ali Skye, someone I interact with on Facebook and various other places, who does a lot of research into the English military of this period and essentially inspired this video. So full out props and credit to Ali Skye and the research that you're doing. I hope you do more of it. I hope we can converse more. And I'm going to do more research on this subject because I love researching the Wars of the Roses, and hopefully we'll find more data. But I suspect that this is essentially my basic summary view here without going into the depth of all the data. Maybe in a future video I'll actually pull out some of the individual sources and show some individual examples. But based on all of the stuff I've read so far, this is what I think is the right overall kind of view of this situation. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Take care. I have been Matt Easton, and I will be again next time as well. See you soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.